Hello, everyone. This is Benny Boo, and I am back after a very brief 2-year hiatus after making poor videos and then just forgetting this channel existed. You know, just normal stuff. But today, I am here to talk to you about a game that I have some thoughts about after playing the Resident Evil 4 remake recently. And it's a game that I have nostalgia for, like so many people did with Resident Evil 4. And that game is
Resident Evil 5.
Now, Resident Evil 5, it's kind of an interesting game to exist, because it had to follow up the critically acclaimed Resident Evil 4 afterward. So what they did to toss things up, I guess, is they added a new co-op mechanic where you're following Chris Redfield, an already established character, but with a new partner named Sheva Alomar. Now, was the game successful in following up Resident Evil 4? I mean, it's subject to opinion, but I think it really was. And does it really need a remake? I don't really think so, but, after thinking about it, I'm kind of open to one. So, I guess the first question is Resident Evil 5 even worth playing? I mean, clearly I'm a little biased, but I definitely think it is, especially for people that really liked Resident Evil 4. It kind of has a similar campy vibe to Resident Evil 4, has a similar mix of the action and survival horror that Resident Evil 4 did, although a little less on the survival horror side. It's a different take on the partnering system where instead of you're escorting someone like Ashley, instead you're partnering with someone who's just as able to do things as you are. And so in that aspect, I would say it's a great co-op game to play with another Resident Evil 4 fan. And just as far as continuing from Resident Evil 4, it's a direct follow-up following the Las Plagas stuff. In fact, the enemies are the same thing. And the story's pretty basic, but I would say it's a pretty good story and it's satisfying. A nice follow-up to Resident Evil 4.
Hold on!
Now, be forewarned, there are Resident Evil 4 plot spoilers ahead. There are going to be a few spoiler moments, so I'll just put up the timestamps to times to skip to if you don't want to be spoiled. Long story short, Resident Evil 5 picks up sometime after Resident Evil 4 ends, a few years, and somehow there are Las Plagas-like infection parasite things popping out of people in Kijuju, which is a Western African village. So clearly the Plaga that Ada took from Leon at the end of Resident Evil 4 was not held in safekeeping. So basically Chris and Sheva, they need to find out why. So I'm not going to say much more than that because I don't want to spoil Resident Evil 5 for people who haven't played it. But I do say myself that it's a pretty good follow-up. You get to see some Resident Evil characters that had not, at the time, been seen for quite a while, like Chris Redfield and Wesker. So it's just very, very satisfying to play, I would say. Now, the next question is, does it need a remake? I mean, like I said before, I don't really think it does. You can already play it on PC, PS5, Xbox Series X, the Switch, all modern platforms basically. But then again, Resident Evil 4 also was available on all of those, so I don't think as far as Capcom's concerned, that's really something that would prevent them from doing it. In a lot of aspects though, I would say that Resident Evil 5 is a lot more playable in the current day and age than Resident Evil 4 is. For one, the controls are a lot less clunky, there are no tank controls you can strafe. The PC version has crosshair aiming. Unfortunately, the console ones don't, or when you play on controller on PC, it still shows the laser aiming. So there is that. And the games still have a little bit of issues, like for instance, you can't really move while aiming or reloading. But like Resident Evil 4, the AI is balanced around these quirks. And the soundtrack is also still great. They wouldn't even need to remake that. Kind of like in Resident Evil 4 Remake, where they had the option to switch to the original soundtrack if you paid for the deluxe edition, which I have issues with. I'll talk about that later. A friend said that it gave JRPG vibes, the soundtrack, and honestly, I kind of agree with it. It has a lot of those just like intense violins through a lot of the climactic moments, and so I really like it. But once again, nostalgia speaking. Now, all of that said, I already mentioned this, but I think Capcom might be planning a remake.
Hold on!
Now, there are spoilers for the Resident Evil 4 remake ahead, so skip to this timestamp if you want to avoid that. Now, basically, Resident Evil 4 Remake adds stuff that links up Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5 even better than the original did. So when you're in Luis's lab near the end of the game, Luis has correspondence with someone whose initials are AW about giving him a plaga to assure his escape. I don't remember the exact wording. I'll have the video up. Now, this makes Ada stealing the plaga from Leon make a lot more sense, because clearly that was part of Leon's original arrangement. And then there's also a new scene after the original game ends that adds some stuff. And there's a certain person with blonde hair and sunglasses that Ada's talking to about his plans to improve the human race and that billions will likely die and be annihilated. I think that AW that Luis was emailing earlier may have been a certain Albert Wesker. So I would not be surprised if Capcom is already planning a remake, not to mention the ending of Resident Evil Village has Chris Redfield with stuff that very clearly leads into the next Resident Evil game. So I would not be surprised if they want to release RE5 as kind of like a lead-in or a side game to whatever happens in Resident Evil 9. We'll see. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not even going to claim that is what they're planning, but I would be very open to them doing that. Now that I've established that I think they are making a remake of the game or are planning it, I'm going to talk about some of the things I'd like to see in a potential remake. Now, Capcom, in my opinion, has been killing it with the remakes, so I'm definitely very open to them making a remake of Resident Evil 5, which I didn't think I would say until I played Resident Evil 4 Remake, but here we are. Now, one thing that I would like to see them keep in the game is the core elements, like, for instance, the campy vibe, the action survival horror mix, the co-op mechanics especially. But I want to see a lot of the typical improvements in a remake you'd expect. Like, for instance, Resident Evil 5's ally AI and enemy AI are both pretty trash, to be completely honest. Sheva does a lot of stupid things, or Chris if he's your partner. Like, for instance, just uses green herbs right away when they get 2 green herbs, and there's a red herb probably coming up. They'll just combine the 2 green herbs right away for no reason. So there's a lot of things, not to mention they just kind of like sometimes stand there and get killed by things. So I'd like to see some improvements there. And then despite the fact that I think the controllers are better than RE4, I still think the controls can be improved. Now, if they made it play like Resident Evil 2 through 4 remakes, I think that would be A-okay. I think they played really well. Resident Evil 2 Remake still plays pretty nicely. So obviously moving while aiming and reloading, melee attacks, that's one thing. I would like to see the melee attacks not have your allies get knocked down, because that was an issue I had in Resident Evil 5 when I was replaying it, is constantly Sheva would try and attack an enemy with a melee attack, and then I'd get knocked down and then be left vulnerable. So maybe like have them be able to attack in a way that they don't hit the ally as well. I don't know. There are opportunities for that. Another thing, inventory management is kind of difficult because there are just a lot of menus to go through with no pausing. Like, you can right click and move items around and combine them, but anything beyond that is just way too many menus, like wanting to give something to your partner. So I would like to see some improvements in that aspect. And then just something else I'd like to see is, I thought that Resident Evil 4's knife mechanics were cool. And Resident Evil 5, you didn't really do much with the knife, kind of like RE4, where it's like a very weak weapon or used to open boxes. So I think some cool like stealth kills and pairing with it would work. And also, they would probably add knife durability. So I think some more storage space to compensate for that would help a lot, because 9 felt very restrictive, even though you're supposed to share between you and your partner, but it still felt kind of restrictive. So maybe 10, 12 slots, maybe 12 might be too much, but a little more, you know. So basically, I'd just like to see them add things to make it worth playing over the original, like Resident Evil 4 did. So another thing not related to the gameplay that I would like to see is like how Resident Evil 4 got the treatment to make the Spanish instead of Mexican Spanish. I'd like to see a more accurate language for the area, because Kijuju is supposed to be in Western Africa, but then the language they're speaking is like close to Somalian. So yeah, that's something that I think they would probably improve. Another thing is, I don't want to see the stuff that they pulled with Resident Evil 4 Remake, and that's just kind of a, you know, symptoms of the current industry, but like less microtransacting, less deluxe editioning with, you know, random gameplay related bullshit. I don't want to see any of that. I just want, you know, a good game. And then also, please release Mercenaries on launch. Why was that not the case for Resident Evil 4 Remake? Now, if they do remake Resident Evil 5 and change a lot of things that are kind of controversial, like some things happened with Resident Evil 4 Remake, the original still exists. So even if the remake isn't, everything that I wanted it to be or other RE5 fans wanted it to be, that's perfectly okay. And, it kind of becomes an option between the original and remake. And I kind of feel that way about RE4 Remake as well, because it's a really well done remake. But some of the things just, you can't get because they removed it. So there's always the original to play. You can play it with the original mechanics on modern platforms. So, I don't think it's an issue if they do change things drastic, unless they change it to where it's not the same game. I would expect it to probably end up existing alongside of the original instead of replacing it. Now, that's not to say I won't be critical of changes I dislike. If they, completely change the game and make it, super edgy, not silly like the original is, I'm going to have issues with that. Because, after all, Resident Evil 5 is my Resident Evil 4, and I really want to see it done well. But I'd like to know, if you took the time to watch this whole video, what did you think? Let me know in the comments or whatever, because I'd like to know if you're just as much a fan of this game as I am, or if you really dislike it and want to see them change it. I don't know, let me know what you think. And until then, have a good one. See ya.